Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're doing something a little different. We're stepping into the intense world of aviation forensics to unravel a tragedy that unfolded in the literal blink of an eye. We're going to examine the anatomy of an accident, specifically looking at the devastating and incredibly brief 40-second flight of the aircraft designated VT-PSJ. So here's the mystery we're trying to unravel today. How exactly does a completely routine training flight end in disaster, just 40 seconds after takeoff? I mean, what could possibly go so catastrophically wrong so fast that it brings down a perfectly good airplane on a crystal clear day? Now, we're not just guessing here. To figure this out, we're grounding this entire explainer in the official facts. Specifically, this document, the official report from India's Directorate General of Civil Aviation, or DGCA, published back in July 2011. They did a massive, multi-layered investigation into this specific aircraft, a Cessna 152 operated by the Pioneer Flying Academy. And looking at the cockpit that morning, there was a massive contrast. On the left side, you've got the pilot instructor. This guy was a seasoned pro. He held a valid commercial pilot license with almost 2,500 hours of flying experience. But right beside him, a trainee pilot with literally 0 hours of flying time. It was his very first time up in the air. But as you're going to see, the emergency they were about to face was so sudden and honestly so severe that even a veteran pilot with thousands of hours couldn't have saved them.
Section 1. 40 seconds in the air.
Let's roll the clock back and look at the timeline. It's morning at the Donipur airstrip in Aligarh. Starts off like any other day, right? The aircraft passes its daily inspection at 0730 UTC. By 9:40, they're cleared to taxi. But okay, here's where we get our first little mechanical hiccup on the ground. At 9:45, the instructor reports some unease with the rudder pedal, so the chief engineer actually comes out to the runway, lubricates the pedal and the cable, and then physically tows the aircraft back and forth just to make sure the nose wheel is working smoothly. Everything checks out, they deem it satisfactory, and they get clearance for takeoff once again. All right, so they line up on runway 11, 0 seconds. Takeoff. Fast forward 20 seconds, they are smoothly airborne, climbing up to around 200 to 300 feet. Everything feels totally normal. But then, at exactly 35 seconds, a panicked radio call just bursts through to the ground station. The instructor is frantic. He's saying they are losing height rapidly. And then, at exactly 40 seconds, impact. That's it. Less than a minute from wheels up to crash down. Section 2, Impact and Rescue Efforts. Okay, put yourself in the shoes of an investigator arriving at the scene. This visual right here is pretty shocking. This is satellite imagery pulled straight from the DGCA report, and it shows the crash site is a mere 740 meters from the edge of the runway. They had barely even cleared the airfield perimeter before plunging straight back to the earth. And the physical evidence on the ground? It's brutal. The plane violently hit a 1-meter-high mud bund, which is basically just a hard ridge of earth used for holding water in a paddy field. Hitting that solid wall of dirt practically stopped the plane dead in its tracks. It skidded maybe 10 meters, but the force of that direct impact completely crushed and extensively damaged the front cockpit area where both pilots were sitting. Now, you have to acknowledge the incredible response from the locals here. Villagers working in the fields saw this happen, dropped everything, and just sprinted toward the wreckage. Without any hesitation, they actually smashed the broken windscreen and cut the seatbelts to pull the two men out of the crushed structure. Incredible bravery. But tragically, despite those heroic efforts, both pilots suffered fatal injuries. The instructor was declared dead upon arrival at the hospital, and the young trainee passed away just a few days later. Which brings us to Section 3, Analyzing the Wreckage. So obviously, investigators needed to know why this happened. And when they got to the wreckage, they found something absolutely chilling. The official report explicitly states, and I quote, "The propeller of the aircraft separated from the engine along with the mounting bolts and bushes." Just let that sink in for a second. The entire front propulsion system, the giant spinning metal fan that keeps the plane in the sky, literally detached and tore completely away from the aircraft in midair. And structurally, the consequence of that is immediate and completely unforgiving. Without that heavy propeller assembly attached to the front, the aircraft's center of gravity shifts violently backwards, and all your forward thrust disappears in a split second. So that sudden loss of height the instructor panicked about on the radio? It wasn't an aerodynamic stall or bad weather. It was the direct, unrecoverable result of this massive mechanical failure, the loosening of the propeller mounting. Section 4, The Probable Cause.
because heavy steel propellers just don't fall off planes for no reason, right? So investigators started digging into the paperwork. They went through the engine's maintenance history and found it had actually been overhauled in the US back in October of 2009. But when Indian investigators double-checked the records with the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, they found a glaring and deadly oversight. The propeller mounting bushes, which is the exact hardware that keeps the propeller bolted to the engine block, were not replaced during that overhaul. Now, even with that past oversight, aviation has overlapping safety nets for a reason. Fast forward to November 2010, the aircraft goes in for a rigorous, mandatory 200-hour inspection. And the manual for this is super strict. Mechanics literally have to take off the spinner and propeller, use a magnifying glass to check the bulkhead holes for cracks, and thoroughly inspect those mounting bolts. This entire procedure is built specifically to catch the exact kind of hidden wear and tear that leads to a mid-air separation.
But here's the real kicker. When investigators asked the operator, Pioneer Flying Academy, for the release notes on those specific mounting bushes, or, any piece of documentation proving that this vital inspection was actually carried out, nothing. They came up entirely empty. The Academy completely failed to submit any details. There was an absolute glaring lack of documentation to prove these vital parts were ever checked, tightened, or properly torqued during that mandatory inspection.
So what does this all mean? Well, it leaves us with a pretty profound and unsettling reality. A highly experienced pilot and a young student on his very first flight lost their lives not because of a sudden storm or pilot error, but because of a missing piece of paper and a skipped step in a maintenance hangar. When minor oversights like that start compounding in the shadows, unchecked and unrecorded, we really have to ask ourselves, just how safe is our safety net in the sky? It's a heavy reminder that in aviation, proper documentation and diligent maintenance aren't just administrative red tape. They are literally what keeps us alive up there. Thanks for joining me on this explainer.